Welcome everyone to the Destination Net Zero webinar. We'll take 30 seconds as everybody assembles and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Destination Net Zero webinar. I'm Ted Ferguson, President of the Delphi Group and your host for this session. The Delphi Group is part of a constellation of organizations that includes Globe Series, Excel Partnership, Leading Change, and Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. We all work together towards a common purpose to achieve a sustainable, prosperous, and socially just future in a generation. We provide services and platforms that empower business, government, and youth to improve performance while accelerating the clean economy. Now to today's topic. It's been said that it's the journey, not the destination, that matters. When it comes to achieving net zero emissions and important climate targets, it's both. Today's webinar will feature lessons from Canadian business leaders on how to set and achieve credible and rigorous net zero science-based targets. We're thrilled to have so many of you here today with us. Well over 700 people have registered for the webinar, just showing us how important the topic it is, and we're thrilled to get into it with all of you. On a personal note, I'm also thrilled that this webinar is happening today because, hey, it means I get to put on a nicer t-shirt, nicer shirt than a t-shirt for a change, something with a collar. Hey, pandemic life has gotten, well, that basic for me and probably many of you. Those of us not on the front lines, we're staying home to do our part to stay safe. But while we're locked in lockdowns for the short term, I personally am determined to use this time for thinking of ways and making things happen which have a more positive impact on the planet for the medium and the long term. And that's what this session today is a part of. By my read and my calculus, we're going to come out of this pandemic with the most significant roster of commitments globally to net zero and science-based targets ever. This is a great thing. After 20 years, again, personally, of working on climate change, on the issue of climate change, I was absolutely knocked off my chair by the positive headline in the BBC over the holidays that spoke to some new math that added up all the net zero commitments by governments and companies across the world. And lo and behold, climate change might actually be able to be halted. Halted. I couldn't believe my eyes after so many years of really quite pessimistic headlines. But there's always a but. It does make sense. It's net zero. We're talking about net zero. These are very powerful commitments, and science-based targets are very real. They're tied to the Paris Climate Agreement carbon budgets. Now the but. I'm reminded that we need two things to make this outcome real. More organizations taking on ambitious net zero and science-based targets, and to make sure that those targets are actually met. Those are key considerations to the math that article was doing and was talking about. So that's why we're here today. And that's what our organization is going to be focused on for the upcoming years, increasing the number of organizations in Canada that have ambitious targets, climate change targets. And we are positioned to help them get on that path and attain them. All the while, making sure those targets lead to economic growth and greater social justice in our country. Talk about ambition. We're ready for it. We're excited by it. Now let's get started for today's session. Before we kick off the important land acknowledgement, I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining from unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. And I'd like to invite each of you to reflect on the land you're joining us from and start flexing that interactivity muscle. Put in the chat where you're from and how you feel connected to that place and what the Indigenous history is there as well. I also like to, for this year, go beyond just a land acknowledgement. I like to state my intent as it relates as an individual and as it relates to reconciliation. For me personally, over the last year, I've participated in 2 blanket ceremonies, extremely important ceremony exercises, with regards to getting a deeper understanding of Indigenous history in Canada. And I brought both my children to them because I think it's critical that they understand that history in a better way than would otherwise be taught to them, perhaps in schools. So that's been part of my action as it relates to reconciliation. And I encourage you also to put in the chat what you're trying to do to improve this situation in Canada. Now to this session. Before the global pandemic hit, the call for demonstrable climate action from businesses, often in the form of long-term carbon reduction targets, was growing steadily. The concept of net zero has risen in prominence ever since. As countries, cities, companies, and others are increasingly committed to reaching this goal, on the home front, Government of Canada, I'm sure most of you will have noticed, had a small announcement before the holidays all around developing a plan for the country to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So it's important to recognize that this is a journey we're talking about. At the Delphi Group, we help organizations on that journey to develop and establish credible net zero targets. And the credible is the key part. Developing the business case, advising on strategic and technical components of target development, and helping companies understand how that climate policy landscape that I just referred to, how it implicates their journey. Now, let's go to all of you. As I mentioned, incredible assembled crowd today. We're just thrilled with the interest on this topic. We're going to do a poll. We want to understand the people on this webinar. How are you seeing this issue of net zero, this opportunity of science-based targets, these ambitions? We want to understand how you're contributing with your organization, or as an advisor, or as a supporter of another organization, or as an individual. What's your own net zero target? We'd like to hear from you. Lots of people helping organizations, a few organizations that do not have a target right now, maybe don't have plans, but I hope by being here today, it'll give you the inspiration to turn that around, but important to be honest also. Appreciate that. And we've got organizations setting, people here from organizations looking at setting net zero targets, and 24% from organizations that have. Well, that's a rich sense of what we have here. Lots of engaged people, informed people, and obviously very motivated. So thank you very much for your input. So now to the rest of our, well, really to the body of our session. Over the next, not quite 90 minutes, we're at about 8 minutes in. We're here from across the country and all virtually, of course. It's the fun part. Look how easily we can all get together. We're thrilled today to have 3 iconic Canadian companies with us. And they're represented by their very brave and ambitious senior leads for sustainability and climate change. And I say brave for a very specific reason. While net zero targets and climate ambition is really an exciting space right now, it has been a tough slog for many of us to get attention on this issue. And it takes a great deal of patience and positive energy. And the people here today represent much of that kind of both attitude and resilience. I'll put it that way. So the companies are Maple Leaf, CN, and Enbridge. I mean, again, could we have more iconic Canadian companies here? I don't think so. Collectively, these 3 organizations represent a very significant aspect of the Canadian economy, and their leadership positions on climate change can be an example to all other Canadian organizations considering the same. So we're going to hear from them through a Q&A with me on how and why their companies and they as individuals have chosen to lead on climate change targets. Now let me introduce them. First of all, Trevor McLeod. He's the Director of ESG and Public Policy at Enbridge. He has personally helped the organization adopt their net zero target. He's been an internal champion and their climate change strategy, as well as their Indigenous policy. Trevor has done a great work and achieved much with the help of an amazing team at Enbridge and a very supportive leadership group as well now. And we're thrilled to have him with us today. Chantale Després, Director, Sustainability at CN. You'll hear from Chantale the great story here as adopting science-based targets at CN. One of the first Canadian companies to do so, and one of the first in the transportation and rail sector globally. And they've gone on to help SBTI, the Organization of Science-Based Targets, really improve their rigor and understanding of what strong carbon ambition looks like in their sector. So we're thrilled to have Chantale here today. Tim Faveri is our third Vice President, Sustainability and Shared Value at Maple Leaf Foods. Now, Tim represents really a combination of our first two, because he's helped Maple Leaf adopt both net zero and science-based targets. And this is a very significant feat. So we have this great combination today where we have Enbridge with a net zero target, CN with a science-based target, and Maple Leaf with both. And we can get into that dynamic and understand their path and their considerations in that regard. These companies are also members of the Excel Partnership and Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. These are organizations that are leading on climate and sustainability issues, and they're learning partnerships that empower companies like theirs to improve their corporate performance through sustainability leadership. So before we go to a few other items ahead of our Q&A, I do want to note that after our Q&A, we'll hear from a few of you who will be joining us on screen as People's Panelists. Selected through the registration process, we've asked several of you to come on board and be a more active part of the webinar with some questions that are coming from your perspective and your organization. So that'll be after the Q&A. But please, for the rest of you, we encourage you to put questions in the chat as well. Select all panelists and attendees on the little drop down. Make sure everybody's able to see your question, and we'll try and get to those as well if we can. Now, we're mostly presentation deck free today. What a concept for a webinar. However, we did want to leverage that much maligned medium to set the table here on ambitious climate targets. We're going to do that with one of Delphi's sustainability experts, consultant Puninda Thind, my colleague. She is going to share some important data to support successful climate change target strategies. Then we'll follow her information, couple slides, couple table setters to get us set straight, and then we'll switch to the Q&A with our guest experts. So with that, over to you, Puninda.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everyone. I will briefly provide some context on net zero targets, its drivers, and discuss the terminology. And later on, I will share some strategies for establishing credible targets. As you know, we are seeing a growing number of cities, regions, and organizations set or pledge to develop net zero greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And this increased interest in net zero targets represents a really key opportunity to drive climate ambition. And it also creates the pressing need for a common understanding on what net zero means for organizations and how they can get there. Commitments to net zero targets have doubled over the past year. Over 1,500 companies in 2020 set net zero targets, which is a threefold increase from 2019. Over 553 companies globally have set science-based targets through the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and of these, 8 are Canadian companies. And we are seeing, global campaigns around getting businesses to set net zero targets, some of which are noted on the screen here, including the Business Ambition for 1.5, the UN Race to Net Zero, Under 2 Coalition, Climate Action 100, the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which particularly represents asset managers with more than 9 trillion in assets under management that have committed to transitioning their portfolios to net zero by 2050. And this rising momentum for long-term net zero targets can be attributed to a few factors or drivers. The first one being the growing emissions gap. As some of you may have seen, the UN's most recent emissions gap report shows a widening gap between the current global emissions and the levels needed to achieve the Paris Agreement's objectives. And the overall message is that much greater action is needed and urgently, which has sharpened the focus on setting more ambitious targets. Secondly, broad-scale investor interest is a key driver. Recognition of climate risk as a systemic financial risk is increasing. In fact, a survey of Canadian institutional investors representing over $2 trillion in assets under management revealed that 87% say that climate change remains a priority. So they are demanding transparent and standardized climate reporting through frameworks like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and increasingly including climate change considerations in investment decision-making. And country-level commitments, continue to increase. Overall, more than 100 countries have pledged to get to net zero by 2050. Last year, in addition to Canada, we saw such announcements from Japan, South Korea, South Africa, the EU, and the US, elected a president who campaigned for net zero by 2050. And this is tied to the deepening public scrutiny and pressure. There's demand for credible and robust action towards urgent decarbonization as public awareness around this has grown significantly. So when it comes to defining net zero, not all net zero targets are the same because there is currently a lack of standardized definitions and criteria around what constitutes a net zero target for organizations. Outlined on the screen here is the definition from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Within the corporate context, however, the definition is not so clear yet, leading to some confusion and inconsistent claims. The terms carbon neutral and net zero emissions are sometimes used interchangeably, and then there are also terms like climate positive and carbon negative. But there has been some notable recent developments on this front. The Science Based Targets Initiative is currently working to develop a science-based global standard for corporate net zero target setting, which is slated to launch later this year. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Ted, to lead us into the panel discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Puninda. And now we'll turn the screens on and the mics on for our expert guests, who are I've introduced already, but I'll say again: Tim Faveri, Trevor McLeod, and Chantale Després from CN. Welcome, everyone, and let's get started. My gosh, we're almost right on time too. So as I noted at the beginning, I'm going to run through a number of questions, and we've asked our guests, our experts, to weigh in on these. Not each of them will be asked to respond to all the questions, so we've got a bit of a mix here, but we'll get started. And in total, we have about 5 questions. So to begin with, and this is a question for all 3, and I'd like to ask Chantale to go first, Trevor to go second, and Tim third. The question that I think many of the people on this webinar would really benefit hearing the answer to is, what are the key drivers for your respective organizations for setting net zero and or science-based targets? What are the key drivers for getting you to where you are today? So first, over to you, Chantale.
Thank you, Ted. Hi, everybody. I'd say, at the top of the list is, you recognize the science of climate change. I think that's important. So setting a science-based target aligns with that. My journey in sustainability and in terms of climate science, I come at it as a non-expert, really. I have a background in marketing and a business degree. So early on, we aligned with the CDP for our climate disclosures. And I've appreciated looking to international frameworks to understand these topics. And I think to also evolve our thinking, right, globally on these topics, starting with baselining to understand scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, to understand our strategies and the impacts on our business. So for us, it was really through the work and our disclosures on climate with the CDP that we came to science-based targets. And our first kick at the can was in 2016, which is when the first kind of tools were available to submit a target. And our first kick at the can was refused or declined. And you know, Ted, as you alluded, you know, we have done some work with the science-based target because we came back to them to better understand why our first kind of attempt to have them review and approve our target was not approved. And out of those discussions came a willingness to talk about sector-specific kind of curves and decarbonization. And in turn, we then started to work with them. And some of the work that we do with SBTI or CDP or even our investors is around education on our industry. And for us, one of the particular issues is that we tend to get lumped in sometimes, less and less, but lumped in with passenger rail, which from a carbon and fuel efficiency perspective is a pretty different kind of game. So those are the kinds of conversations that we have with SBTI. So in 2017, we resubmitted, you know, a sector specific, and we were approved. So it was, you know, pretty early on. We were amongst the first 100 or 150 or so kind of companies to have an approved science-based target. And at that time, we were on a 2-degree kind of science. So that's what we had approved. You know, other than that, you know, leadership for us has been important. And I think for me, even internally, if you can position as a leader, it gives you credibility internally and externally as well. Efficiency is in our DNA at CN. We've been on this pathway since before, you know, climate science and disclosures on climate were really significant. We've been focused on this for decades. And so this leadership and this DNA of efficiency is also one of the drivers as to why we set a science-based target. And we also now more and more are recognizing the value that comes out of it as a differentiator with our customers and with our investors who are now starting to really understand this topic. So it's not just, you know, one reason. I'd say it's multiple kind of reasons, some of them more with me and even personal in terms of wanting to advance the agenda, and then some of them corporate, and then some of them experts driven by some of our stakeholders.
Right. Yeah. Value drivers for a company in the value chain, CN. Thank you, Chantale.
Absolutely. Welcome.
Trevor, how about you? Key drivers for Enbridge and for yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I think Puninda and Chantale hit on many of the important ones, right? The big drivers: science, of course, investors, policy trajectory, the public desire to lead. I think those are all great and right on point. And maybe I'll amplify a couple of those, and then maybe hit on one more. So the science, I think it was a big moment in 2018 with the IPCC's special report on global warming, and you know, really came out with the conclusion that we really needed to hit net zero by 2050 if we're going to keep global temperatures, you know, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so that was a really compelling report and had a real big impact on us at Enbridge. And so that was one. The policy trajectory, as others have mentioned, you know, if you think about in Canada, of course, the Trudeau government, but now also the Conservative opposition have indicated comfort with the 2050 net zero piece, and in the United States, that's really with the Biden administration, it's a stated objective as well. So the policy trajectory is there. Investors, of course, and investors, you know, get a lot of credit, I would say, for pushing companies to set aggressive target, and I think that praise is warranted in many respects. If it weren't for investors being comfortable with this, it would be very hard to make such investments. And for a time, you know, that was frankly the case, is that, you know, the investors wanted energy companies to kind of stick to their knitting, right? Do what you know and not expand into some of this other stuff. So I think it's important to recognize that investors have really have moved on that. And that doesn't mean that, you know, your capital allocation discipline changes in any way, just has to, you know, be broadened a little bit. So I think that's an important piece. And the TCFD, of course, has been huge. When we did our TCFD report in when was it, September 2019, and of course one of the 4 pillars is metrics and targets, and so it gets you on a path to reconsidering these things and making sure that you're on a forward trajectory. And so that's a critical one. The one that maybe I would like to spend a little bit of time on is our employees. And our employees have been pushing hard for Enbridge to lead on climate. And I think that's important in all sectors and for many companies. The energy industry, as you would know, is at the heart of this climate debate. And in many ways, pipelines and the midstream sector is a leverage point for that debate, and a much broader debate. And so I think that can take a toll on employees. And you got to have conversations that are tough conversations about what you're doing and who you're working for. And it's really critical to note that I think our employees recognize that we have a really big role to play in part of the solution in climate, and really wanted the company to push to be a leader on this. And so that was a huge part of our effort and our decision to set a net zero target and set us on our path.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Great, delineation to the employee piece and great explanation of the value in terms of a driver. Thank you. Tim, how about for you and Maple Leaf?
I guess I get to go last and say all of the above, because I think it's quite well aligned, actually. For Maple Leaf, I'll also highlight a significant driver for us, and that it's unique to our company because we have set a social purpose. We set that social purpose, at the end of about a 10-year transformation of fixing the business to growing the business. And that when a company sets a social purpose, you focus on why your company exists and what societal needs are at play that your company can influence. And when we looked at that and realized, the food system, which we are a big player in Canada, globally, the food system is accountable for almost 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, definitely 1/3 of freshwater use. The society in general wastes 1/3 of their food. There are very, very big societal issues at play with our industry. When we set our purpose, which we call Raise the Good in Food, we also set a really bold vision for the company, a guiding light, a guiding star for us to try and achieve. And that vision is to be the most sustainable protein company on earth. And so as we cascaded our purpose down through the organization and did a lot of employee engagement, and to Trevor's point, we did a number of activation sessions where we asked employees, how can you raise the good in food? How can you contribute to our vision and our purpose? And a very common response was about the planet, about our environmental goals. We had already had very, very bold environmental goals for our industry, 50% environmental footprint reduction by 2025. And that comment back from most employees was, well, if we want to be the most sustainable protein company on earth, why are our goals only set at 50%?
Right.
The leadership committee that was overseeing this, we all looked at each other and said, yeah, why? So let's take a look at this. And that started about an 18 to 24 month strategy development process that I led to take us towards well below 2 degree science-based targets and the achievement of carbon neutrality, which we achieved just over a year ago. So top down, we have a passionate leader. That's obviously important. Yeah. We've got a vision cascaded down by our leadership team, but it was the bottom up almost that was the catalyst. And I think that's pretty powerful, because I think that's probably common to all organizations on the call.
Yeah, if you're going to get it done, you got to rely on all your teams to be a part of it. So there's such significance there. Great, thank you, Tim, and all three of you. Next question, directed at Tim and Chantale. Long-term net zero targets, they seek to make transformational changes across a business, but also the whole value chain, the ecosystem, your whole upstream, downstream, all the things associated with you being able to be a successful business. So how do you connect long-term targets for your organization to overall business purpose? You've mentioned purpose, Tim already, and others, but not just purpose, but strategy. How do you integrate it into strategy? Chantale, you mentioned energy efficiency as a core tenet for CN. That's the kind of thing we want to understand better. So for both of you, and I'll go to Chantale first, how does it factor in to your business strategy? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I knew that was going to happen.
How could it not happen?
So, part of the work that we're currently undertaking with the science-based target is that, because we were so early out of the gates, we need to adjust. We live in a world where 2 degrees is no longer sufficient. So we're working with the latest models for our sector, which are well kind of below 2 degrees. And the other significant consideration for us is the diversification of our business. So what we're looking at now is setting a new science-based target, but in fact, it's multiple targets that we're looking at. We're not just a railroad. We operate significant, trucking fleet and a vessel fleet. So trying to squeeze all of these previously into that one model that was built for rail was challenging. And now we're disaggregating. And so what that means is, we have to work with all of these internal groups. Yeah. So there's no silver bullet solution to this. And I like to call this a team sport. So there are a lot of implications in terms of the functions that we need to work with internally. And part of the strategic integration, actually, the target setting is one of the drivers, right, for strategic integration. So that's been extremely helpful. And then, efficiency is part of our DNA, which has implications for our operations teams. And so we're working with all of these teams that operate all of these various fleets that we're operating across North America. But for us in our sector, we also see cleaner fuels as part of our pathway to decarbonization, which is different from the traditional efficiency pathway that we've been on. And so that's a whole different bunch of people internally. We're dealing with our procurement team and our fuel management experts and our M&A team. And so there's a whole lot of other players that have come on board again. And again, like these science-based targets that we're setting can be strategic, drivers for the integration, and it can bring everybody else around the table. So that's the internal kind of story. And then externally, we're collaborating as well. So we don't make the fuel that's going to help us decarbonize. Today, we buy fuel, and we see that it's important to our pathway. So that means we have to collaborate with external players in terms of fuels and what we can procure. And then we also don't make the locomotives that we operate. And there's operational implications for these different types of fuels in our locomotives. And so we have to expand our view and strategic integration and how we work both internally and then with our, with our suppliers. The other thing that's, I think, interesting for us is that we're a significantly capital intensive industry. And when we buy rail assets, locomotives, for example, we use them. We use them for a very long time. We use them 25, 30 years. And we also build the rail that we operate on. And so we feel that collaboration with government is really critical to helping us move to, to zero carbon into the future. And to that end, we've collaborated very closely with Transport Canada. We have a long-standing memorandum of understanding with Transport Canada. We've been focused on reducing both greenhouse gas and air emissions as a sector for a couple of decades. And the evolution of that MOU, the last time it was negotiated a few years back, was to collaborate on a pathway to decarbonize our sector overall. So all of the players are at the table, whether it's passenger rail or freight railroads, and even the smaller regional railroads are there as well. So it's going to take that collective kind of effort to be thinking about what is the new technology of the future and how do we move in that direction together. including with OEMs potentially. And in the meantime, how do we work with fuel producers to
And all
further
those players
decarbonize?
are critical to your business strategy. They're a part of that whole business strategy landscape. Exactly.
It's a team sport.
Okay. Thank you, Chantale. And over to you, Tim. So the question was around how are you connecting it with business? You mentioned purpose, so that's a a perfect segue into it. But how do you get it into the day-to-day business priorities?
Yeah, sure. Our purpose really is that umbrella strategy for us, and because our science-based targets and our carbon neutral status is integrated as part of the purpose. We've been able to somewhat operationalize all these aspects underneath that purpose. Carbon, when we became carbon neutral, also then comes to a very high level. And, this is going to be, such a common statement for everyone. Over the years, sustainability practitioners and CSR practitioners have had to try and make a business case, with the operations to say, no, energy efficiency is a good thing. It's going to save us money here. By going carbon neutral, we actually have set an internal price on carbon. And that is certainly transformational, because now we've integrated carbon across all our capital decision making. So for example, if we're working on a big heat recovery project in one of our facilities, if we're able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by rolling and scaling this technology out across multiple plants, and we get a 20,000 metric ton reduction on greenhouse gases, the offsets that we are purchased have a price. Let's say it's $20 a ton. Well, there's $400,000 that can put towards the return on investment calculation to drive those projects ahead. That's been transformational for my interaction with the finance team, and connects us much more wholeheartedly through the whole, I call it, life cycle of the project. Because when a capital project goes, you have finance involved, and engineering involved, and operations involved, and legal involved. And right from the onset, we have it in the financial model that avoided carbon costs through the construction of this capital project is right there at the very beginning. And so that's been transformational for us. And fully agree with everything Chantale has said as well. And the energy efficiency alone, for those on the webinar that are starting that journey, depending on the size of your company, that's millions of dollars annually of savings. And every company wants to save money and do better for the planet. Now that you can measure it from a carbon perspective, those kind of considerations can be input into that strategy as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Ted, I know you didn't want me to jump in on this one, but if I could just take a moment, and just to amplify something that's been said, but the very act of establishing the net zero target, when accompanied by a genuine effort to figure out the best way to meet that target, really forces important long-term strategic discussions, right? And so you imagine trying to dimension the potential financial impacts 30 years out.
Yeah.
That involves everybody across the company, and there's a lot of rigorous debate. And so I just wanted to emphasize that the very act of setting it, and it's sort of what you said at the beginning, it's not just the destination, it's also the journey in this context.
And well, it speaks to the rigor needed, and the target framework establishes an expectation in this rigor. And we've talked about the role of the Chief Sustainability Officer in our work, and it's this organizational authority. What kind of authority did people in your roles have to weigh in on decisions? And that target ambition enables that authority to be a factor in decisions, and through carbon price or what have you. And I think that's gets to what you guys are saying. Well, it's okay that you jumped in, Trevor, because the next question is mostly for you, but we'll might go to Chantale after. So let's geek out on methodologies here. And as I said at the beginning, we've got companies with net zero, with science-based, with both. We're going to throw it to Trevor here, because Enbridge took on a net zero target. And again, as you noted, there are a lot of contemplation there of what to adopt and how to do it. How did your company approach methodologically a climate ambition? How to define it, how far to go, what to include?
Yeah, well, it was a long and circuitous journey, I would say. But I think the thing that we did that was very helpful was we started with the greenhouse gas protocol. So corporate accounting reporting
Yep.
standard, and so that really helped to paint a bit of a roadmap. It was extremely helpful, and I guess for those of you who aren't familiar, it's essentially an accounting framework, right? And ensured that we covered all of our bases and served to structure conversations with senior leadership and gave our accountants more comfort that the sustainability folks knew what they were doing from that perspective. So it's very helpful as a roadmap. And you know, I suspect without the benefit of the GHG protocol, we probably would have figured out at some point that we needed in a double counting protocol, but it would have taken more time, right? So to have that roadmap painted for you is very helpful, and recommend it. You know, and while we didn't formally set a science-based target, we did do an assessment of our targets against the SBTI methodology, and ran into a couple of challenges there that might be worth surfacing just for the group. And the first one is really around, you know, pipelines aren't currently included in the SBTI methodology for oil and gas, and you can kind of get around that by employing a more generic approach, which we were able to do for our scope 1 and 2 emissions. But the second challenge was probably a bit more difficult, and that's, you know, true SBTI certification would have required us to set a scope 3 target, and some ambiguity continues to remain around what is in scope for a scope 3 for the midstream, and frankly, we don't yet track all of our scope 3 targets. And so our solution to that, recognizing that we had to acknowledge the role of scope 3, we had to recognize that it's not just about the emissions that we control directly. What we did was we set a new methodology, a new metric for tracking the carbon intensity of the energy we deliver. And that gives the credence to the scope 3 element,
Right.
and a pathway for measuring that and for into the future. So that's where we went.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that speaks to exactly that dynamic. And for any of those, especially on this webinar and going down this route, this is you know, net zero versus scope 1 and 2 and offsets, and then science-based is actually a little less strict for scope 1 and 2, but yet you're not using offsets, and so it creates a great dynamic, and it's a really fun conversation with CEOs and C-suite and board if you get to have it into that level of granularity. Chantale, you've been down the science-based route for a couple of years now. How are you feeling about the standards and methodologies and this whole world in terms of how are you finding your way through it?
You know, when you're working on a science-based target and you kind of showcase the curves, you know, the big gigantic drop, there's a really great graph that everybody can pick up, like all roads will lead towards net zero 50, right? So right away, if you're looking at setting a science-based target, whatever kind of timeline you're giving yourself, eventually that's the direction. All the curves lead into that direction. I think, you know, the challenge with all of us is, you know, specifically, I'll speak for the rail sector, we don't have a clear view to 2050.
Right.
So it's not clear yet. There's a lot of great work being done in terms of, you know, what is the alternative propulsion, you know, of the future in our sector. And that's part of the pathway work that we're doing with Transport Canada. You know, and some of it internally as well, in terms of the discussions, and Trevor alluded to it, you know, it's a level of comfort that needs to be achieved in the discussions. And we all know, I think, that some of the companies that have gone quick out of the gate to announce a net zero 50 target are now struggling to be able to defend it and explain it to some of their investors, for example. So, you know, and sometimes, quite frankly, I'm torn, because I like the whole, and Tim talked to it, that whole North Star, what are we aiming for? What is our purpose? Where are we going? I believe in that. Like, we need these trajectories, But then there has to be some sort of a balance with, okay, but how are we going to get there? And what's our level of comfort with that pathway? And, you know, those are some of the challenges, I think, both internally and externally. And so it's like, kind of, when will you come out and say we have a net zero 50 and then be able to be comfortable with that? And certainly for us, we want to be, and we've observed, you know, some companies kind of struggle a little bit with coming out and saying, we have a net zero 50 target, but not really being able to define it. So it's a tough nut. Like, I can see myself on both sides, and I'm trying to, you know, play the middle ground on most days and balance both of these kind of perspectives.
Play the middle ground and still make progress. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to combine, you'll follow me here for a second, Trevor, your fourth question into one final question for all three of you. And the fourth was around governance, Trevor. So if you can weave that into your, to this last question, please do so. But for all three of you, we'll take this last one and then switch over, transition to the people's panel questions. So, specific to your sector, you've alluded to some elements and in terms of what's unique about achieving long-term targets in your sector. Now, how about barriers? What are some of the barriers, some of the things you need to overcome to be successful in your target ambition that are perhaps germane to your business, to your sector, technological things you're trying to, you know, get through, organizational, cultural, market dynamics. What's unique barriers that you feel you're going to try and overcome or need to overcome to be successful on your net zero or science-based target journey? Tim, are you okay if I go to you first? You're on mute too. There we go.
Thanks. Yeah, lots of barriers, right? Lots of journeys within journeys when it comes to these kinds of topics. I just jotted down a couple, and kind of goes back to the first one goes back to methodologies and the role that data plays in setting these targets. You can, you know, big data is such an important part of setting these targets and then measuring and developing KPIs moving forward. Organizations really need to get a handle on it. Sometimes there's too much data, right? And you can't see the forest through the trees. Other times there's not enough. So you need to pick a modeling framework and stick to that. And that rolls into, you know, how you report, how you develop your scorecards and everything. So, you know, I hear and feel the pain, you know, when Trevor talks about scope 3, because in the food system, we have massive, you know, 80% of our emissions are scope 3. And it's based on a lot of modeling. And so every year we try and improve upon the credibility and the quality of the data that we can get from our supply chain. And then reset and our baselines accordingly, and that's a lot of work, right? The other one right off the bat is how government policy right across Canada, let's keep it Canada specific right now, is going to come together. You know, right now on carbon we have a patchwork quilt. We've got provincial and federal carbon programs. That's great that we're aligned, but the differences present really unique challenges for businesses that operate right across all those jurisdictions. And that's proving to be a barrier for getting capital, looking at projects, engaging with our supply chain as well. And I can just imagine for a big company, for a farmer, for example, who's in our supply chain that wants to participate, it's a completely different foreign language to them, right? So lots of barriers to overcome. So I'll turn it over to Chantale and Trevor too.
And reminder, this is not the end of the webinar. We're not ending on a negative note. We got to be honest. You got to be honest about these things in order to identify them and overcome them. And your last one on government policy, and I can recall, 2 years ago, talking with somebody from a global multinational with operations in Canada. They had a global target. They couldn't attract the capital for low carbon in Canada because the policy signal was too bifurcated and too complex in Canada for them to be a good investment globally within the organization for low carbon. And, you know, so those mixed signals, I think we're getting past a lot, and certainly the change with Biden in the US is going to mean many things to all of you and all of us as well in that regard from a signal point of view, but it can make have a real negative impact on your ability to move forward with investments. Trevor, how about you in the energy sector, in the energy business? No shortage.
No challenges in the energy sector, Ted. No, just kidding. You know, so I think, you know, it's very difficult regardless of sector to set targets for 2050, right? The timeline, the uncertainty associated with it is very challenging. I think one point I'd want to make is that it really is helpful to set shorter term timelines or targets as well, right? Something that you can kind of recalibrate over time to continue to allow you to be on trajectory to meet that 2050 target. So I think that's pretty critical, both from a you know, from perspective of getting everybody to sort of see the path, and also to be able to put plans in place that are a bit shorter term. And of course, you even need shorter term sort of annual, we've linked it to compensation. And so need shorter term annual targets to connect it to our short-term incentive plan. So lots of important pieces there and challenges in setting that up. But I think, and you know, we'll have a lot of barriers to overcome in terms of reducing the emissions that we control directly, our scope 1 and 2 emissions. But we see a path, right? When we went through the modeling exercise and looking at, you know, technology that exists today, and you know, there are pathways there, and we kind of took multiple pathway approach to sort of dimension different scenarios to how you might get there, and that was quite an exercise. But you know, that you know, that gave us the comfort, I guess, that there are pathways. We want you need the costs to come down on certain things for sure in order to be able to make it there effectively. But so when I think about it, you know, I'm not trying to dismiss those challenges because they're big, but from our perspective, it's really the scope 3 stuff. It's the fact that we're this leverage point in that bigger debate, right? To put maybe a finer point on it, even if we reduced or eliminated all of our emissions, we're still going to be in for some opposition about, you know, some of what we do, not all of what we do, but moving the oil and gas in particular. And so I think that's a big piece. So it's not enough for us to set scope 1 and 2 targets and demonstrate progress against those. That's really important from a differentiation sort of investor perspective, to differentiate yourself and do that, but it's not enough. And so we think we need to be also investing in solutions that reduce emissions across the value chain. And then that becomes really important from an energy perspective, energy sector in Canada perspective in particular, to remember this is all about competitiveness, both competing on cost and on carbon. And so it comes down to your approach, right? You have to maintain a really disciplined capital allocation approach while finding efficient ways to meaningfully reduce emissions. And I think our ability to do that successfully as companies and as an industry will determine whether we're successful.
Right.
So small challenges.
Yeah. Well said. All right, 2 minutes left. Chantale, what's your favorite barrier, or which one keeps you up at night? That you would
this
be
is
comfortable
easy
speaking
stuff,
to?
right? It's just easy stuff. I agree with Trevor. I think, you know, setting targets to timelines helps. So we have annual targets. We have a 5-year target with Transport Canada on the MOU, and then a 2030 target. So I think that helps a lot. But you know, relating to a couple of comments made both by Tim and Trevor, we operate across, you know, many jurisdictions, and not only in Canada, but also in the US. So the policy piece is challenging. Capital for us is challenging. Railroading is a capital intensive game. So linked to policy policy is important, and also subsidies and programs for piloting and those kinds of things. I can't underline enough the importance of those, because we do have to make smart capital allocations. At the end of the day, we want to decarbonize, but we also want to stay in business. Right. So it's balancing, right, this pathway, looking to new technologies or deep decarbonization, but making good financial decisions and balancing all of that, making sound capital investments and decisions. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not easy stuff, but those are some of the barriers and the considerations. So, you know, policy is key, subsidies are key, innovation, piloting key.
Yeah, they all help to make it or get over those barriers and send the signal also to decision makers internally that if there's a policy framework supporting it, and a lot of the jurisdictions you're operating in have hopefully aligned carbon signals, but it certainly makes the case more or emphasize the importance of including these things in those capital decisions and so on. Great, thank you very much. We covered a lot of bases. We're now going to switch to our people's panel, where we have 3 individuals who are going to join us one at a time and add their perspective in to this conversation. And so it's going to take a second for my colleague Rachel to bring up our first, but I'll introduce her while she's searching through the 700 attendees to click on her video and welcome. Linda Cody will be joining us as soon as she's found amongst the audience. And so Linda, of course, previously worked at Enbridge and was a colleague of Trevor's and helped fight the good fight to get them to where they are. And as Trevor said, just made this job easy now. But Linda's been in the corporate world and in the environmental group world and even in the Olympics sustainability world. And as she says, you know, I always likes to refer to things as not wanting things to be a freestyle event. I think Linda's career has been a bit of a freestyle event. It's very impressive. And she now leads Pembina. I mean, Pembina is one of Canada's leading environmental organizations, both an environmental group and an institute. And when we think about, and why it was, you know, really important to hear from Linda today and Pembina today, it's critical to have an environmental group voice and their involvement in this journey on long-term targets related to climate change. So if you think, I would assert that environmental groups have been, let's say, Mother Nature's conscience and auditor, not just conscience, but also auditor, right? As it relates to the sustainability journey more broadly, not just climate. And so now with net zero targets, science-based targets becoming more common, I believe their role will only grow. Hi, Linda. And so over to you, Linda, for your question. And it's going to go to all 3 panelists. So I'll let you fight over that in a minute. But over to you, Linda. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone?
Hear you.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I'm joining today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations on the West Coast. And so Trevor, Chantale, and Tim, you've mentioned, and as we all know, with the Biden-Harris government taking office in the US next week, and COP26 happening in Glasgow now less than 10 months from now, the net zero toboggan is obviously picking up speed. And as you've also all noted, the date that really looms largest on everyone's screen right now isn't net zero by 2050. It's how many emissions can we reduce between now and 2030 so that it'll be possible to get to net zero by 2050. So here's my question. From your company's perspectives, what are the top 3 policy and technology shifts that absolutely must happen to enable the step change in emissions reductions that your companies need to achieve in the next 9 years or less to meet your climate goals? And I'm going to give you a hint that from a Pembina Institute perspective, stronger federal provincial alignment on Canadian climate policy to provide more stability for long-term planning and investment is near the top of our list of things that need to happen. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Linda. I will throw an order out, Chantale, and then Tim, And then Trevor, you each have 2 minutes to engage on Linda's point. Chantale, over to you.
Hi, Linda. It's good to see you. I'll talk to one kind of in particular, and because of its importance to not only to CN, but to our sector, which is clean fuels. So renewable fuels for us is important. And linking back to policy and the comments that you've made, Linda, we have emerging clean fuel standards, across the various jurisdictions, where we operate, and including, at the federal level, that will have an impact on our operations. But when we look at the next 10 years, we definitely consider technology, and I'd say continuous technology tweaks to the locomotive fleets that we all kind of operate. And we still feel that we can extract more efficiency out of these fleets. And so we're always looking for the next kind of innovation opportunities that we can apply. And certainly big data is part of that. And so we're looking and digging into the data to better understand where we can extract, better operate, and gain more efficiencies. So technology and big data is definitely there. But the other major kind of, piece that helps us along that pathway in our sector will be those renewable fuels. So the blending of these fuels within the diesel fuel that we use in our locomotives. And we'll see higher and higher blends as these clean fuel standards kind of move ahead in the next 10 years. But if we just follow that regulatory pathway, it's not going to be enough to get us the deepest decarbonization that we could get. And so, the considerations are the costs of these fuels that are a lot more expensive than the diesel fuel that we're buying today. So those are some of the challenges that we face. But, we're looking at, again, no silver bullet kind of answer to how we get to the next 10 years. It's a silver bucket of solutions that we're really looking at to get us to 2030.
Silver bucket, hopefully, yeah, okay. Good one. So clean fuel, supportive policy, and technology that can embrace those changes as well is what I'd summarize that answer for Linda. How about you, Trevor? Or did I say Trevor or Tim?
I think I'm next.
Tim, you're up.
Hi, Linda. Great question. For us, as a farm to fork company, there are a couple that kind of just jump right out to mind. One is the policies that are going to enable companies like Maple Leaf that are big producers of organic waste, like pig manure, that can actively be captured and have the methane extracted to produce renewable natural gas. What a great opportunity. It's a critical part of our decarbonized pathway to be able to do that. One of the barriers is that, we have 250 farms spread out all across Manitoba. And so where are we going to put all this renewable natural gas? Trevor, maybe we can have a conversation about that, right?
But we've got a nice ecosystem developing here.
There needs to be an infrastructure if we're going to move quickly towards renewables to decarbonize across any industry sector and the policies to enable that. The next one is around, again, being a farm to fork company, regenerative agriculture. It's a buzzword out there right now. The Biden administration is calling it climate smart ag practices. It involves sequestration of carbon in soil and treating the farm or the soil as a carbon asset for farmers, providing farmers with a monetary value on carbon through a price of carbon can increase their livelihood significantly. So through annual crop cycles, there is definitely a decarbonized pathway when we embrace that entire supply chain. And we're just not there yet, right? With the fragmentation and offset protocols that need to be developed. It's coming, but those are the kind of policy spaces that we want to push towards.
Great. Thank you, Tim. So we got RNG, regenerative agriculture, using organic waste. Great example. So again, to refresh, Trevor, it's Linda's question. Technologies or policies required to achieve breakthrough on methane GHG emission reductions, breakthrough reductions not out to 2050, but out the next decade? What kind of things are you looking at?
Well, as Linda's my former boss, I'm used to answering tough questions from her, but she usually gives me the opportunity to stumble around just in the office as opposed to in front of a bunch of people. So let's see how this goes. You mentioned policy. I think that's critical from a patchwork perspective that Tim talked about, and the harmonization is important, but also the pendulum policy concept is important, right? We don't want policy swinging wildly back and forth and changing, so we really need to focus on that certainty. So that jumps to mind. And harmonization, not just across Canada and with the provinces, that's important, but increasingly it's important to harmonize with the United States, right? And what's happening down there and going to happen down there. And in particular, I think they're immediately of border carbon adjustments or tariffs and being inside that tent as opposed to outside of that tent. I think that's critical, and maybe I'll get into that in a bit. And then the third one is kind of harkens back to what I said earlier about the broader energy sector, energy system challenge, and it's around carbon technologies like carbon capture, use and sequestration, and a 45Q like policy like they have in the United States, a tax credit for incenting investment in this. And I think if we're going to get to net zero in the energy sector, we're really going to need a push there. So that's the other one. So with respect to these, I mean, I think Enbridge, a lot of our emission reductions specifically will come from technologies that exist, some of which I think need to come down in cost. But, our pathways that we've painted are really, solar self-power is a big piece, greening the electricity grids and efforts to do that are critical. Application of, as Chantale talked about, artificial intelligence and predictive analytics are critical to improve the efficiency of existing assets. And then there'll be replacement of things like gas compressors with either more efficient ones or with electric ones. And I saw a comment in the chat, and just wanted to say to folks, I see the comments in the chats, but I've sort of been trying to engage, but happy to answer the questions that have come up there as well. So much of this stuff that we mentioned in our pathways really comes down to cost and who pays. And again, I think it comes down to competing on cost and carbon as a sector and achieving net zero in the energy sector for Enbridge, but more broadly, I think direct air capture and carbon capture, use and sequestration are critical. And anything we can do to bring the costs down there are really, really important. And then I guess I would just add on that utilization piece in CCUS, really a little plug there, right? To extend those tax credits to, using carbon or to carbon usage or utilization, so you can utilize it in industrial processes, and just to give a bit of a push there. Those are my pieces.
Well, you got a pretty good diversity of responses there, Linda.
Yeah, I got a few notes there. Well, thank you. I know there's someone else that's going to beam in here next. So
yeah, the hook comes through now. Thank you. We'll try and get back to you. We'll see if we have enough time. Okay, thank you, Linda. So next in our people's panelist is Robin Sita. She is principal consultant at ICTAR Sustainability and co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers Climate and Environment Steering Committee. And so she is going to help us bring a youth perspective into our discussion and our Q&A. And there, Rachel found her. Nice work. And the question is going to be for Chantale. So Robin, as you come up on the screen and are unmuted, and there you are. Now you just need to unmute. There we go. Excellent. I should have just an unmute sign. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. What's your question for Chantale?
Okay, so Canadian youth are more informed and more passionate than ever before about our climate and the health of our natural. They have a great amount of energy, passion, and capacity to support and drive Canada's climate agenda. Given 2050 is 30 years from now, how can organizations participate in intergenerational collaboration and meaningfully engage youth and minority groups in the development of equitable net zero strategies and solutions?
It's a great question. And on many days, I think of your generation, and it keeps me going, and you give me hope. And I certainly understand the importance of engaging. And I don't think I have all of the answers. I certainly recognize the importance of bringing your generation to the table. Some of the things that we've done that we think about, it's certainly the work that we do with non-for-profits. And I'll throw, a little diamond star to Ted and the team, but we do support and have been a key supporter of Leading Change, for example, that helps identify future leaders in this space and kind of expose and mentor and include, the youth. So organizations like that, when we partner with non-for-profits, whether it's Earth Day, and we have a new one that we'll be announcing, in the coming weeks that I can't kind of state publicly right now. So the work that we do with non-for-profits that engage youth in particular, I think is one of the ways that we think about engaging your generation. We do a lot of work at the university level as well. So that's another way. You're all working on projects when you're in school, and we want you to be, thinking about these challenges that we all face and get going on it while you're in school and while the next generation's in university. So that's another thing. We also offer internships. I actually had an internship with me that's turned into a full-time position, and he's now working to run our employee engagement program. We have another intern over the summer. So when I think about meaningfully engaging youth, those are some of the things that we're trying to do at CN to kind of engage. I don't think it's all of the opportunities and all of the solutions. And we would look again to the young generation to also help us identify how to do it better.
Great. Thank you, Chantale. And I have to say, the effect of the youth climate marches, when we as a company deal with C-suite, deal with executives and boards, it was amazing how that representation spoke volumes. And there's always been climate protests, and there's always been, efforts to sort of bring people to the street to get the message across. But there was an intergenerational thing that happened with some of the very senior people in organizations, seeing all these kids so passionate about this issue and thinking about the next generation. And maybe it's a weird moment where people of a more senior age worrying about the next generation and seeing the faces. Something happened, and it really enabled a lot of the progress. It's one of many things, but I certainly heard it echoed by many. So it's a pretty critical part of the puzzle. So thank you, Robin. Keep up the great work. We got one more People's Panelist to switch over to. All right, next we're gonna have Terry Lynn Morrison. And so she is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communications with Indigenous Clean Energy. And they have an amazing amount of programming and activities and involvement across Canada on advancing clean energy in Indigenous communities and the whole business proposition and social proposition around it, much less the environmental ones. And so Terry Lynn, I miss seeing you in the office, but it's always nice to see you, at least virtually, because we share an office in Ottawa. Terry Lynn, your question, and it's going to go to you, Trevor. Given the importance of Indigenous relations with Enbridge. Over to you, Terry Lynn.
Thank you, Ted, and Happy New Year to you. I certainly do miss going to the office. And also, I just wanted to applaud you for sharing your personal actions that you're doing to improve the situation in Canada with its relationships with Indigenous peoples. And also for inviting me to participate in this great panel that your team has put together today. I am coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe in Ottawa. And my question for you, Trevor, is how are you incorporating partnerships with Indigenous communities as part of your emission reduction strategies to meet these targets?
Great, thanks, Terry Lynn. So to get that, Trevor, partnerships with and you got to get off mute as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Terry Lynn. you know, I think it's an important question, and it's one that's important broadly, but it's also important to me. And so I'd start by saying that one of the reasons I went to Enbridge was in discussions with senior leadership about a commitment to Indigenous economic reconciliation. And so it's really a critical piece. We believe it's both the right thing to do, but it's also good business. And so an important question. I think that Indigenous nations and groups can be really involved in our net zero piece. And in fact, you know, so for Enbridge, but I think it also holds true for other companies. There's lots of opportunity. We are already working on solar self-power initiatives to power some of our assets with Indigenous nations in mostly south of the border of the 49th parallel in the US, but there's also opportunity in Canada to do that. So that's a big piece of it. Yeah, another one that really jumps to mind is with respect to offsets. So we've reserved the right to use offsets to buy down some of the harder to abate emissions. And we really want to partner with communities and in particular Indigenous nations on some of that. And I think that there's an opportunity we haven't fully developed our offset strategy yet, right? We are just kind of in the early days of what that really looks like. So hey, there's an opportunity to work together on some of that, but also on developing the offsets themselves, right? And some of these are, you know, nature-based solutions, for example, forest management practices, or sequestering carbon in wetlands or in soils or in the oceans or what have you. And so real opportunities there to work together on that. And then the other thing I would say is we're always open to discussions about partnerships on new investments that we're making, whether those be directly related to the net. I guess they're all now directly related to the net zero target, but whether they be you know, a pipeline or you know, investments in renewable natural gas or hydrogen or what have you. So I think the door's open for that. And you know, one thing I would say is that it's really useful if you're a nation or an Indigenous group kind of looking to partner on some of these things with some of these companies, to really pay attention to the Investor Day presentations, which sort of set out those strategies, and then go and be proactive and just approach and say, you know, we'd be interested in working together on X, Y, or Z. And I think it's a surprisingly effective tactic. So anyway, just some ideas.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. And as a company with a very bold Indigenous policy, and just the openness that I think you've helped create amongst your employees and the team and your business to look for those kind of partnership opportunities, the encouragement you've given will hopefully, you know, create that openness mentally as well as, you know, business wise to look for more opportunity. So thanks, Terry Lynn, for bringing it up. Thanks for being here. Okay, that wraps up our people's panel. We mastered the technology. Everybody appeared and disappeared, although we haven't yet, so that's good. But actually, we are going to disappear briefly because Puninda's got a couple last slides that summarize the rigor, summarize the methodological considerations you want to take in your strategy. What needs to be in the strategy? So she's got a couple points we're going to flag before we take 5 to 10 minutes to wrap up. But over to Puninda to remind everybody and actually specify some of the things that have already come up in the Q&A when it comes to building a robust long-term climate strategy.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks everyone for a great panel discussion and just following along in the chat as well. So thanks everyone for chiming in with your comments. You know, if you are considering strengthening your climate targets or developing a net zero strategy, we wanted to broadly summarize, you know, some of the key elements to consider for developing these robust targets, many of which our panel discussion touched on. First, you know, the boundary. For example, does the net zero target cover all material sources of greenhouse gas emissions within your organization's value chain? And is the time frame for the target defined? Is the net zero target supported by interim science-based emission reduction targets, and are they aligned with corporate and business planning. Depending on the size and complexity of your organization, it may be beneficial to, as was discussed, develop these interim goals that can help you assess progress along the way and determine areas where you're performing above expectation or are on target, and where you may be, falling behind. And this really ties into accountability and looking at whether these internal accountability mechanisms for meeting these interim and long-term targets are effectively set up. Next up is, mitigation hierarchy. Much like the first 3 R's of waste management, the focus should first and foremost be on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and, not on purchasing carbon offsets. And lastly, but quite importantly, the transparency around all of this about the target setting process, as well as the pathways for reduction as well. And if you are considering, starting on this journey or may find yourself somewhere on this journey, briefly wanted to discuss what steps you can follow towards setting these net zero targets and what that could look like. So if you are starting on this journey, one thing you can kind of start with is looking into what others in your sector are doing. It's useful and important to understand how net zero fits within the broader goals and strategy of your organization, and what those climate related risks and opportunities may be. And socializing this strategy with your key stakeholders. Long-term targets, as we heard, seek to make transformational changes across the business. And it's important to connect that to the overall business purpose and strategy. So from an implementation perspective, as Chantale mentioned, it's a team effort and it requires a cross-functional effort across the board. Next up is quantifying and analyzing your greenhouse gas emissions data and your unique business context. Data is a key part of it all. So taking into consideration emissions from across your value chain and considering your business as a whole. Historical greenhouse gas emissions data for scope 1, 2, and 3 will help you understand your organization's patterns, including where you have previously reduced emissions, as well as areas of improvement, and considering third-party methodologies like the science-based targets. And then allow you to really assess those reduction pathways and prioritizing that mitigation hierarchy. So as mentioned, reducing emissions should be the top priority, and in some cases, the low-hanging fruit of emission reduction opportunities may already be exhausted. So it would be helpful to understand, the current technology and innovation landscape that our panelists discussed, what role that plays in your pathways to reduction, and how do the pathways for meeting these targets align with your broader business strategy and planning. So potentially consider engaging suppliers across your value chain to reduce emissions across your business, and seeing if your organization can enable others to do the same through potential, development or deployment of technology and solutions. Setting these robust targets and establishing those governance mechanisms to build those internal accountability that we alluded to before is also so deeply important, not only for the long-term targets, but also for the interim science-based targets that you'll kind of set up for your journey, and transparently communicating all of it. The target setting process, the methodology that's used, the definition of net zero, the plans and pathways for achieving these targets, as well as your performance against those on an ongoing basis. Transparency can really enable that accountability and provide some positive pressure to translate targets to action. So as this momentum towards net zero and science-based targets kind of continues to rise, it is going to become especially important for organizations to chart a fairly robust pathway forward. So excellent. Thanks for the panel discussion. Yeah, very simple.
Everyone. Pretty straightforward. Get this done tomorrow. Yeah, that's a great overview. You can't approach this with the blinders on. It's a big lift, but that's okay. It can get done, but it's important to be honest with all the ingredients. I haven't had time to follow the chat, but I keep wondering if people keep saying, yeah, what Chad Park said, what Chad said, I'm so curious. I'm going to have to look afterwards and figure out what very impactful comment, Chad, you've made. So thank you for your contribution in the chat. It's fantastic.
Just another day in the life of Chad Park.
Yeah, it is. It's very good. So last item for our session, back to the panelists, 2 minutes each. Maybe from what we've talked about today, or maybe thoughts that brought you to this discussion already. One key next step action, like when you're looking at your next quarter, your next month, your next week, what are the things for the start of this year that is your priority, given you already have the targets established? What are your current priorities for making progress on your journey? I'd like to go to Tim first.
Sure. For us, the priority is to roll up the sleeves and get going on decarbonization. We've got potential pathways identified to decarbonize on scope 1 and 2, and the makings of a strong scope 3 engagement plan as well. So it really is roll up our sleeves, get our fingernails dirty, pilot, research, test feasibility of these technologies, and decarbonize. Start it.
Excellent. Yeah, getting started and getting some action and learning from it. Yeah, it's got to be that attitude, right? How about you, Chantale? What's your month, quarter priority as it relates to CN's target?
Well, I think I alluded to it in some of my other comments. You know, we set the target, our science-based target, when the science was more in a 2-degree kind of world. So, you know, one of the things that we're doing now, and we've just submitted, so working with the SBTI to resubmit and get a target that represents a well below 2-degree scenario to align with the latest climate science and the report that Trevor alluded to in 2018. And, you know, in the last few years, there have been acquisitions in our company. So we need to engage with these. And this new exercise with the science-based target for the first time has put us down a path of disaggregating. We will come out publicly with one target, but it'll be the roll up of several targets, a rail target, a trucking fleet target, as well as a vessel fleet target. So, you know, as Tim said, we're rolling up our sleeves, pulling together the team, and we have a lot of hard work ahead of us, aside from, you know, the collaborative work that we're doing with SBTI. So those are the priorities. Hit the ground running right away. No time to waste.
You guys are all good. I gotta go. I gotta get to work. Let's wrap this up. Oh, we got 3 minutes left. Trevor, 1 minute. What's your immediate priority in terms of getting going? And you're the most recent announcement on targets amongst these three. So
yeah, we rolled these out in November. We took a quick breath, and one of the things we did was we announced that we were linking our targets to compensation. And so right now, in fact, in 3 minutes, I've got another meeting about that and developing those key performance indicators and make sure that's on track. Development of a offset strategy. The fund never stops, right? And either long-term strategy and sustainable finance. We didn't talk too much about that today, but you know, what's the plan there? So lots going on.
Excellent. You're going to be from 0 to 0 on that compensation discussion, depending on the day and the month and the quarter end. Good luck with that. Yeah, to your point on financial institutions and the financial sector's perspective on this, it's flagged a few times here, but it's a good segue to the wrap up. And that is that we will be following up with everybody who's attended today to ask your priorities. If we're going to do more of this and more through Globe and through Canadian Business for Social Responsibility to help further and advance these concepts and appreciation for them and activity around them in Canada. Who else do we need to engage? Who needs to be part of the conversation? Who's part of the solution set? And one of those you'll see in the survey is related to the financing side of this. So thank you for that. Thank you for the three of you, Tim, Trevor, and Chantale. As I say, my brave partners here, because you have fought the good fight for your organizations and broader than that on these important ambitions for many years. And it's wonderful to be part of it with you. For everybody who's joined us, I just want to say, hold on for an exciting year. 2021, we're going to have, for all us sustainability geeks, we've got a lot to work on and a lot to prove. And that for us in the Globe Delphi constellation, we're also excited. Globe Capital, we're finding a way to go virtual and hybrid, and it's going to be quite an event. It's the event from Globe Forum, or from Globe Series. So we go from Globe Forum to Globe Capital, figure out financing the clean economy. And that's coming up in April. Hope everybody has a look at that, takes part in that, and helps make sure it, as a forum, allows us to be even more successful with our long-term climate targets. So thank you very much, everyone. You'll hear lots from us, and I hope we hear lots more from all of you this year. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.